Story 1. The Lantern Circle in Dry Creek Hollow. I wasn't even supposed to be that far down the trail. I'd taken the wrong fork coming out of Dry Creek Hollow, thinking I could shave some time off the walk to the old mill. The sun had already slipped behind the ridge, and the air had that still, hollow quiet the woods get when they're holding their breath for night. Every step felt louder than it should have been, the crunch of leaves too sharp, like I was the only moving thing in miles. The trail narrowed until it was hardly more than a game path, overgrown with vines that tugged at my boots. I was about to turn back when I noticed the light. Faint at first, just a shimmer through the branches, warm against the growing blue of the evening. I thought maybe someone was camping, but when I pushed through the brush, I saw them. 9 lanterns set in a perfect circle in the clearing ahead. They weren't the kind you hang on a porch. These were old, with cloudy glass and metal frames mottled by rust. Their flames burned steady, but the light wavered in a strange way, throwing shadows that seemed to drift slower than they should, like they were moving through syrup. Inside the circle was a scatter of objects I couldn't place. Bones, small ones, arranged in spirals. Glass jars half filled with cloudy liquid that caught the lantern light in a sickly glow. A strip of cloth, heavy looking, stained the deep brown of dried blood. The air was thick with the smell of wet moss and something sweet. Sweet in the wrong way, like overripe fruit left in the sun. I stood there longer than I should have, telling myself it was just some hunter's odd tradition, maybe kids messing around. But then I heard it. Footsteps in the leaves behind me, not rushed, not careless. Slow, measured. Whoever it was knew exactly where they were stepping. I didn't turn. I couldn't. The sound stopped just at the edge of the clearing, right behind me. The air shifted, heavier somehow, as if whatever stood there was leaning forward. I could hear them breathing, low, even breaths, like they were in no hurry at all. My eyes stayed locked on the lanterns. I started to back away, slow at first, my boots sliding over the leaves so they wouldn't crunch. The flames flickered though there was no wind, and the shadows around the bones seemed to lengthen, stretching toward the edge of the circle. When I finally turned, the trail behind me didn't look right. It sloped in ways it shouldn't have, bending off into narrow forks I didn't remember. The light from the clearing dimmed faster than it should have, swallowed by the trees. I picked a path and moved fast, not caring if I made noise now. My chest felt tight, like the forest was pressing in on me. Every few minutes, I'd stop, listening. The breathing was gone, but the silence was worse. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own steps. I must have walked for over an hour before I saw the old mill's roof through the trees, the last of the light draining from the sky. I never found that clearing again. I went looking once, months later, in daylight, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, but every path felt different now, like the woods had rearranged themselves. Some nights though, when I'm out near Dry Creek Hollow, I see a faint glow in the trees, just one lantern burning, steady and still. I never get close enough to see what's inside its light. Story 2, The Painted Stones along Ash Timber Ridge. I've been hiking Ash Timber Ridge since I was 12, when my uncle used to take me up there to spot grouse and point out bear scat like it was a secret language. It's a narrow ridge, a backbone of shale and oak that holds the storms on one side and the quiet hollows on the other. I know the switchbacks, the places where the trail slips into moss and leaves, the dead juniper that looks like a bent old man if you catch it out of the corner of your eye. So when I tell you I'd never seen those stones before, that's not forgetfulness talking. They were laid like breadcrumbs along the footpath, flat rocks the size of dinner plates. Each one painted a deep red that time had turned brown, each one tucked half under leaf mold so it took a second glance to understand they were there on purpose. The first stone I noticed because my toe caught its edge. I bent down, thumbed away a smear of moss, and saw a symbol underneath, clean as a fresh cut. Circles nested inside a triangle, lines creeping out from the corners like legs. The paint looked new where I'd rubbed it, wet even, but when I pressed my finger to it, it came away dry and gritty like the last dust at the bottom of a paint can. I'd walked that stretch 100 times, never saw a single marking, but now that I'd spotted one, I started seeing them everywhere. Stones tucked against roots, stones laid half in the dirt, stones wedged into the slope like teeth, each one painted with something different, spirals, crosses with bent arms, dots arranged in neat constellations that didn't match any sky I knew. At first, I told myself it was kids, some midnight dare, a game to give each other the creeps. But the farther I climbed, the more the details started to stack in a way that didn't feel like a prank. A blue jay feather tied to a sapling with string so thin it bit the bark. A brown bottle broken just so, its neck sunk upright in the soil like a small chimney. A length of hemp rope knotted into a loop and nailed at shoulder height to a hickory. The wood scarred where someone had kept lifting the rope and setting it back. I touched the loop and it twitched like a live thing, only it was just the breeze, I told myself, just the ridge wind slipping over. The higher I got, the quieter the world became, like climbing into a dome. The sound of leaves muted, the usual chatter of squirrels gone. Even the flies, which had been buzzing the whole time thanks to the heat we'd been carrying for weeks, seemed to thin out until it was just my breathing pushing the air. The stones drew me onward, no two placed evenly, but always just where instinct said to put a foot next. I tried stepping around them once, just to prove to myself I could. And my boots slipped on the slope, and I grabbed a sapling hard enough to feel something pop in my shoulder. When I looked down, my heel had skidded to a stop against another painted rock I hadn't noticed. The symbol on it, a simple, open eye. There's a false summit on ash timber where folks like to stop and take pictures. A wide slab of rock that leans out toward a view of the valley. I expected to see someone there, whoever had done all this, or at least signs of a camp. The cold stones of a fire ring, a crushed can, a footprint. Instead, the slab was bare, weirdly bare, as though the wind and the years had sanded it down to a smooth table. I set my hand to it, and it was warm, almost body warm, though the air had cooled. In the center, as precise as anything I've seen in a church, was a symbol cut by hand into the rock. An echo of the triangles and circles from the path, only this one wasn't painted. Its grooves were filled with ash. Kneeling there, I felt the way you do when you realize your name has been spoken in a room you thought you were alone in. The ash wasn't scattered, it was smooth, tamped, as if somebody had taken a flat palm and pressed it down. Footprints ran through it, bare feet, small, too small for me but big enough to belong to someone older than a toddler. They came from the far side of the slab and stopped dead in front of where I crouched. Toes pointed at me, ash ridged sharper at the tips like they dug in a little, braced. I don't know how long I looked at those prints before my knees started to ache. I glanced up, sudden and stupid, wanting to catch whoever had made them crouched in the rhododendron, but there was only the thicket of leaves and the soundless space between. I told myself to leave, and my body listened like it had been waiting on permission. I stood and stepped back, careful not to smear the ash, as if it mattered to keep it intact, as if smudging it would cross some line I didn't want to cross. I looked for the painted stones to guide me down, and that's when I realized they didn't run in the same direction going away as they had coming up. On the climb, they had appeared when I needed them, little decisions made for me by color and shape. Going down, they hid. I'd see one at my feet and then stand there, turning, not sure where the next was. The trail around me braided into deer paths and run-off gullies and something like a foot trail, and not. The rope loop swayed in a wind I couldn't feel. The feather pointed downhill, then sideways, then downhill again, like a compass trying to remember its job. Halfway down, I heard a sound I've never quite named. It was not a word. It wasn't birds or branches. It was like someone clearing their throat far off, then closer, then far again. The same small correction repeated until it felt like it was coming from inside my chest. I moved faster than I should have, slid twice, barked my shins on a pair of stones I swear weren't there that morning, and then I was on the truck road, my sweat going cold the minute the wind found it. I didn't look back up the ridge. I walked all the way to the mill lot before I let myself breathe like a person again. I didn't plan to go back. You can tell yourself curiosity is something you can starve, but it keeps its weight by feeding on you. The week after, walking the short loop trail behind my house with the dog, I saw a rock leaned against a root, half in the dirt. I nudged it with my toe and there it was. Red turned to brown, a small triangle with a dot at each corner, clean under the moss like a secret waiting on a question. I told myself it was a coincidence. The next day there were two. By Friday there was a line of them stepping off the loop into the trees where nobody walked, at least nobody I knew. The dog refused that way. He planted his feet and stared at the gap between the beech trunks as if it were a door someone was about to open. I didn't sleep much after that. The images won't leave. The ash pressed flat by a careful hand, the bare feet stopping where I knelt. The loop of rope, scarring, the hickory. I started keeping the porch light on even though I hate what it does to the night. How it turns the yard into an island and makes the woods look closer than they are. Once, around 2 a.m, I saw a shape at the edge of where the light gives up. It was small, not child small but slight, and it seemed to tilt its head just enough to let me know it could hear me thinking. I went for the door and found it already locked, though I didn't remember turning the deadbolt. People around here don't like questions about old things, and Ash Timber Ridge counts as old. If you ask at the feed store, you'll get the brand of smile men put on when they're not going to help you. One old-timer told me there used to be a logging camp up there that wintered over, and a family lost a kid in a late snow, and after they buried what they found, they started leaving signs to keep the rest of them from straying. Another said the paint wasn't paint at all, just clay and blood and something that grows under rock shelves, and if it gets on your skin, you carry the trail with you whether you mean to or not. I didn't ask him to explain. I didn't want him to. A month has passed. The stones behind my house come and go. Some days there are none. Some days there's one. Set where my heel will catch it if I don't look. I step over it and keep walking. I don't touch them anymore. The rope loop on the ridge shows up in my dreams, dangling just at my shoulder, creaking a little, though there's no wind. When I wake, the house is too quiet, like the top of ash timber, and I lie there listening for that first small sound, the clearing of a throat miles away, and then right beside the bed. On good nights, I don't hear it. On bad ones, I do. And in the morning, there's dirt on the porch that wasn't there before. A neat half moon where something small and bare turned on its heel and stopped just short of coming in. Story 3, The Silent Gathering Beside Hollow Fork Creek. Hollow Fork Creek isn't much more than a black ribbon in summer, winding through laurel and hemlock with that cold iron smell that gets in your throat. I went out there because I'd had too much of people for a while. Too many voices, too much neon hum off the highway. The creek's a place where the line of the world tightens back up. I hiked in late, past the old logging spur and through the birch stand, until the sound of water flattened out into a steady hush. I pitched my little two-man on a bit of sandy bank between roots, set a fire no bigger than a dinner plate, and let dusk take the color out of the hills. By the time I banked the coals, the woods had pulled the zipper up on themselves, and the only movement left was the slow unspooling of mist from the water. I woke to a sound my sleeping mind tried to call rain. It wasn't. It had a human shape in it. Soft, repeating splashes that landed the same way every time. Not frantic, not stumbling, step, pause, step, the kind of sound you get when someone's walking the same depth of water on purpose. The night was cold enough that I could see my breath when I eased the zipper open. The moon sat low and sickle-shaped over the far ridge, and the creek caught it in pieces, laying a path of broken light. That's when I saw them, figures standing ankle-deep midstream, a dozen by my quick count, each holding a branch stripped of leaves with ribbons of cloth tied to the tips. They faced upstream, all of them, like they were waiting for something to arrive on the current that hadn't yet. Their faces looked wrong from the start, pale in a way that didn't belong to people in the woods, not glowing, just washed of everything but the shape of bone and the flat of cheek. No hats, no packs, no waders. Their clothes had the look of being chosen for sameness, dark, plain, nothing that would snag a memory. The cloth strips on the branches stirred when the water pushed, and every sway seemed to land at the same moment, as though something downriver were tugging them in a slow metronome I couldn't hear. I remember thinking that if I blinked and looked again, it would resolve into dead snags caught in the shallows. But the branches were in hands, and the hands were steady, and whatever this was, it had weight. You tell yourself what you need to in places where help won't reach you before morning. I told myself it was a group from the church in town, some midnight baptism or summer revival practice, except nobody spoke. Not a hymn, not a prayer under the breath. And the way they stood, too level, too squared to a point upstream that wasn't a bend or a rock or anything I could name, put a small pressure behind my eyes. I started to slide my boots on, not to leave so much as to own the option. The zipper on the tent snagged and made the kind of little sound that is louder than a shout at that hour. A metal insect scream. A head turned fast, not upstream. Toward me, I went still. Then another turned, slower, and then I felt the change behind me, the way the dark has when someone has stepped into it. There was a figure on the bank, close enough that the shape of the branch it held crossed the moonlight and set a thin shadow on my sleeve. I didn't see them arrive. They were just there. The way a chair in your house is there when you step into a room you thought you'd left empty. The branch in their hands had strips of cloth tied like the others, but these were damp, and there was a smell, river cold, and something sweet that had gone wrong. I couldn't make out the face. What I had of moonlight landed behind them, and there was only the suggestion of chin and the darker pits where eyes should be. They were breathing, slow and measured, the kind of breath that doesn't reach the throat, just the nose and the chest top edge. The creek's hush climbed into a roar. I've been in old factories where the exhaust fans swallow your voice even at a whisper. And it was like that, sound with a thickness to it, as though words would sink before they left my mouth. I thought about stepping backward into the tent and zipping it shut like a child hiding under blankets. I thought about the knife in my pack that had barely seen a tomato. I thought about saying, "I'm sorry," though I didn't know what for. Upstream, the figures in the water raised their branches a hair, the strips of cloth aligned, all leaning the same way, as if the current had snapped true. I realized my hands were shaking not from fear, but from the cold rolling off the creek. Something about that made me angrier than it should have, and anger only ever makes me clumsy. I said, "Is somebody hurt?" It came out thin, the word hurt snipped off at the end. The shape beside me did not answer. For a second, a single, clean second, I thought I saw the face brighten like the moon had slid across to catch it. Not features exactly, but the sheet white impression of skin that hadn't seen sun. Then the brightness was gone, and I was back to the suggestion of anatomy. I reached again for my boots and managed to get them on without the laces, just heel thumping them until I felt the wet chill soak through my socks. I stood, slow, keeping my hands where the shape could see them, and eased one foot toward the gravelly bit of shore that led to the trees. The branch lifted and lowered, not blocking me, not clearing a path. It was like being given a measurement. The upstream point that held all their attention started to mean something. I realized I was standing at the exact angle where, if someone came down that water, I would be in line with the last person to see them. It put a set of small, ugly pictures in my head. A sack, a bundle of clothes that needed catching, the dark spill of hair moving the wrong way in the current. If it was that, I thought, then why the cloth strips? Why the silence? Why the way the branches rose and fell on the same breath? The group in the creek stepped once, together, a single pace deeper. The water climbed to their calves and tugged. They leaned on nothing, perfectly balanced. The figure beside me did not move. I tried to tell myself I could be useful at a distance. I backed into the trees, careful of where I put my feet. The angle of the trunks took the moon and folded it until there was only the creek's cut of light left. I stood behind a hemlock with a trunk rough enough to bite my palms and watched the branches in the water tilt as one, a line, tilt back. Minutes passed like pins pushed into skin, small, precise, all in a line. I don't know when I lost the thread of it, only that there came a point where the roar of the creek gentled, not because it quieted, but because something inside me relented. When I looked back, the water was empty. No figures, no branches. The surface wore only the messy lace of its own motion, and the moon had climbed a notch, like it had been given permission. I walked out of the trees to where my tent sat open. The flap hung slack. The zipper was down to the last teeth and parted like a mouth before a word. My pack lay on its side, but nothing was spilled. The knife still sat where I'd left it, useless, reflecting a sliver of the sky. The only change was a dampness in the air inside the tent and a smell like river stones set on a stove. I ran my fingers over the zipper and felt grit where there shouldn't have been any, as if someone had carried a handful of creek bottom and let it sift through their fist. That's all I could make myself register. I broke camp with the kind of speed that blurs steps together and walked out in the low light before dawn. The world grey as a bruise, the birds arguing about nothing as though nothing had happened. I've gone back to Hollow Fork Creek twice since. You can't live here and let a place have you without checking the line again. In daylight, it is the old friend it's always been. Moss like velvet on the stones, minnows arrowing over sand, the banks trying to grow back what the floods take. But when I camp anywhere near running water now, I wake at midnight whether I want to or not. I lie there and listen for the step-pause step that isn't rain. I hold my breath and wait for the moment when the creek swallows whatever I was thinking. Some nights I hear nothing but the honest rush of water and feel silly until morning. Other nights there's a smell of cold iron and sweet rot that wasn't there at dusk, and the tent feels a little damp along the seams, and a fine line of grit will turn up in the teeth of the zipper like a message written where it can't be read. I tell myself it's nothing. I tell myself it's just the creek, working, remembering its old paths. Then I catch myself standing on the bank, facing upstream, and realize I've been holding a dead branch for longer than I meant to. Story 4. The Burial Mound, above Briar Hollow. I only went up there because I thought I could do something decent for once. Take a few clear photographs of the old places around Briar Hollow before they disappeared under someone's ATV trail or a new trespassing sign. The mound wasn't hard to find if you knew where the deer crossed the power cut and where the creek kinked around the sycamore with the lightning scar. Folks said it was a native burial, and maybe that should have been enough to leave it alone, but nothing about its shape felt like anything I'd seen in books. It was too perfect, a rounded back the size of a small cabin with roots clutching over it like a hand half buried, knuckles showing through the soil. I stood on the edge of the clearing and let the woods settle around me. Somewhere far off, a chainsaw droned and then stopped, and after that the only sound was the small shifting of leaves as the sun moved. The ring of stones around the mound looked arranged, not tossed. Each one was set with its flattest face toward the mound, like a row of heads all watching the same thing. I took a few pictures from the edge to prove I'd been polite, then stepped closer, careful not to put my foot on the mound itself. The dirt at the base had slumped in a shallow ditch, and when I crouched to frame a shot, I saw the first carving, lines cut into the face of the nearest stone, worn soft by weather but still holding their shape like something learned by heart. It wasn't an alphabet I knew, just a few intersecting lines and a notch that pointed toward the mound. On the next stone there was another, not the same but kin to it, and on the next, another. I made myself a method: photograph, step to the next, photograph again, cataloguing the ring like a surveyor. The woods seemed ordinary in that patient, observant way they have when they're pretending not to be interested in you. After a while, I stopped hearing birds. I didn't notice when exactly. It was like realizing you've been holding your breath only after you start breathing again. Halfway around the ring, there was a sapling beech with smooth grey bark, like skin. The symbol on the nearest stone was sharper than most, the cuts deeper. Above it, at shoulder height on the tree, the same lines had been scratched into the bark, fresh. The shavings where the blade had bitten curled still damp at the edges. I set my fingers to them and came away with a tacky smear like sap. Only there wasn't any sweet smell to it, just the clean, cold scent of a thing that had been opened. I looked down at the ground the way you do when you're trying not to look anywhere else, and there, set neat in the dirt at the base of the tree, lay a shard of stone with the same lines carved into its face. I told myself the history group would want this detail. People mark things they care about. People get reverent, and reverence makes neat work. I raised the camera to my eye and the air pressed closer to the skin of my face the way it does right before the first cold front of fall. It wasn't wind. The leaves didn't stir. It was a change in weight. The hair along my arms did its old trick and stood up for a better listen. I kept the camera at my eye and took a shot of the beach, then of the mound, then of the ring. When I lowered the camera, I found myself standing smaller than the clearing, like the trees had grown while I was busy. The feeling of being watched is easy to dramatize later. At the time, it felt simple and exact. I knew which side of me held the attention. I could point to the place in the air where it gathered, about 10 feet off my right shoulder and slightly behind. Turning would have been the same as stepping closer. I wanted to say something like, "I'm just taking pictures," as though explaining the terms would protect me. My mouth stayed dry. I lifted the camera again and took one more frame of the beach's scar, though my hands weren't steady anymore, and I think the picture shows it. The sun had shifted, so the mound wore a darker cap, and in that shadow the roots looked more like fingers than ever. I backed out the way I'd come, keeping my steps clean, not running, not breaking the line of the ring. At the edge of the clearing, I made myself stop. It's a strange thing to bargain with something that hasn't announced itself, but I did, silently and a little foolishly, offering care in exchange for distance. The air lightened in a way I didn't believe and yet felt all the same. The birds came back to their arguments, as if someone had let go of their throats. On the hike out, every snapped twig sounded like a message. But the world had returned to ordinary weight by the time I crossed the power cut. I sent the photos that night, a tidy email with a handful of attachments and a couple of sentences about the location. No one wrote back until morning, and then it was the polite thank you of people who weren't going to hike out there. I zoomed in on the carvings and tried to match them against anything online, came up with nothing but other people's guesses. That should have been the end of it. I kept telling myself that the way you tell yourself a story you want to be true. 3 days passed. I forgot to eat lunch twice. On the 4th night, the dog wouldn't cross the kitchen threshold without turning his head to watch the back screen door. He's not a nervous animal, but he lay with his chin on his paws, eyes wide, the way dogs do when they're trying to see through wood. I laughed at him, soft and kind, and then listened with him. And after a few minutes I started hearing what he heard. Not footsteps, not scratching. Just the sense of a presence at the thin world between inside and out. I stood up and turned off the porch light because the dark belongs to itself, and I hate the way a bulb draws a circle like a challenge. The yard settled. The dog closed his eyes. 2 weeks after my hike, I came home late, tired in the wrists and ankles like hard work gives you, and as I pulled into the gravel, I saw it, small as a dinner plate and unmistakable. A stone at the edge of the driveway, placed where a tire would miss it by a clean inch. It was flat and slightly dished from years of weather, its pale face turned up to the sky. The symbol carved there was deeper than any I'd seen on the ridge. The lines ran cleaner. The notch pointed at the house. I left the truck running with the headlights on it too long, like light could explain or erase. The dog sat up, ears forward, and did not bark. I didn't bring it inside. I didn't touch it with more than the toe of my boot, sliding it an inch to the left to see if it had weight or if it would skate like a thing set that second. It moved the way rocks move, with gravity and a little stubbornness. I found my old snow shovel and levered it into the wheelbarrow and carried it to the back corner where the sassafras grows. I didn't bury it. I set it with its face down like a closed book and went inside and locked the door against the nonsense of locks. The next morning it sat at the driveway again, dusted with the faintest trace of gravel, as if it had never been moved at all. I didn't write to the history group. I didn't tell anyone. You can scare people away from you with the wrong sentence. And the stone walked is one of them. For 2 nights I slept in fits, listening for the slight grind that would tell me where it went when it moved, but the house just breathed around me, old wood swelling and letting go. On the 3rd night I dreamed of the mound with its rooted hand, and of the ring of stones counting time in a language that was all angles and patience. I woke before dawn and stood at the back door and watched the yard become itself again, the light finding the places it always finds. Somewhere a chainsaw started up and stopped. The dog sighed and slipped back into sleep. Out by the gravel, the stone faced the house, the notch held steady, and the quiet pressed close. Not threatening, just certain, like a promise that had been made a long time ago and had only recently remembered me. Story 5. The Black Thread Through Fern Valley. Fern Valley is the kind of place that knows how to keep a secret. I've walked it since I was old enough to be let loose with a pocket knife and a warning to be home by dark. The ground there holds water, even in August, and the moss grows so thick you can step without a sound if you mind your weight. That afternoon in October, the fog lay in a shallow bowl along the valley floor, not thick enough to hide the hawkweed and the last yellow leaves, just enough to blur the edges of everything. I was cutting crossways to check on a salt lick I'd set near a deadfall when I saw the line, a length of black thread drawn tight between 2 maples, no slack to it at all, catching the light as a single thin shine in the grey. At first I thought it was a cobweb, but it didn't throw that same ghostly tremble when the air moved. Up close, it looked like something between fishing line and something living, thin but with a twist to it, a grain that caught on the light like hair. I put a finger to it and pulled gently. It held. When I plucked it like a guitar string, it gave a faint humming I could feel more than hear, as if whatever it was tuned to ran below what ears were made for. It stretched on, disappearing into the mist in a straight run that didn't care about brush or convenience. I told myself it had to lead to some old trap or an overzealous surveyor's ribbon left too long. I started following, not because I had to, but because leaving a question unanswered in the woods is like leaving a fire unbanked. The thread moved as if someone had drawn a line across a map without looking up. It didn't go around anything unless it had to. It skimmed a rotting log slick with shelf fungus and climbed the bend of a poplar like a lazy snake. And at each tree it kept its own height, shoulder high to me, just enough to meet my gaze when the slope changed. Here and there, little bundles hung from it, twigs bound together in uneven little ladders, feathers knotted in at the spine, curls of bark twisted into loops. One bundle had a clay face pressed onto it, no bigger than my thumb, 2 eyes poked in with a stick and a mouth cut into a straight line, the edges cracked like someone had baked it in an oven made of patience. Another had a wren's skull nested in twine. They weren't spaced evenly, but each one made the line hum a little under its weight, and with every few steps the hum slid up or down like it was picking a key. I meant to cut it and be done. I reached for the knife I keep for root ball and stubborn twine and thought better of it without deciding why. The line kept going, over a dip where water collects and through a patch of greenbrier that would have stopped any person built of ordinary sense. I worked around the thorns and found the thread coming out the other side without a nick on it, humming steady. I thought about who had hung these things, about hands patient enough to tie feathers so they'd face the same way, about the time it took to measure a valley this long with nothing but a line and a walk. The idea of a kid's prank flipped over into something else in my head and landed on its feet. The fog thickened as I went, not high, just to my knees, a low smoke that made the ground feel farther away when I stepped. The hum of the line settled into me the way a long drive settles into your bones, so that when I stopped, I still felt movement. I started checking the trees around me for a second or a third line, for a web of this stuff, a net big enough to catch a whole piece of the world, but there was only the one. In the quiet, I could hear water I didn't recognize, a slow drip from leaf to leaf, patient as counting. The thread led me to a stand of oaks older than the countymen who named the roads. The largest of them wore the thread like a belt. It circled twice, a dark ring against the bark. And then it passed through itself and tightened into a loop that looked like it had been tied for ceremony rather than strength. Inside that loop there was a narrow opening in the oak, the sort of place where rot starts after lightning has had its say, only it wasn't a dead wound. The wood was puckered but living, drawn together in a tight mouth just big enough for a person to slip sideways through if they were willing to bruise a shoulder. A smell came from it that wasn't forest, damp and sweet, like a fruit set too long on a sill, the kind that smells like your grandmother's kitchen until you see the flies. I stood close enough to feel the cool draft on my cheeks and thought about snake dens and possums and every sensible reason there was to stay back. The thread hummed under my fingers. It felt warm, just a little, like skin after a sun that's gone down. I leaned in, not to go through, just to look. The space inside wasn't black, not exactly. It was the color of tea left on a porch until the ice thins. I saw nothing moving. I told myself I'd turn around, walk the line back, find where it started and cut it there. That's when I felt it. The slightest tug on the thread from somewhere behind me in the valley. A motion that didn't belong to wind or animal. It was a straight, sure pull. The kind you feel when someone checks a line you're holding from the far dock. The bundles hanging along the way answered a moment later, swaying one after another like a field under a hand. I turned, expecting to catch a shape in the fog, a person small at a distance, a deer with a branch caught in its rack, anything with a name. The valley lay empty. The mist only showed me the shapes I already knew. The swaying didn't stop when the pulling did. It kept going as if whatever had touched it had gone on past, as if the motion had found its own reason to continue. I let the thread slip out of my fingers, and it hummed the way a voice does after it's done singing, the last note held by a room. There was a moment when the idea of stepping through that opening to see how the loop would tighten around me felt as simple as stepping off a front porch. I was thinking of my father telling me not to walk under a ladder because it teaches the ladder a shape you'll fit into later. I took a step back. The smell from the opening in the tree swelled, sweet and then sour, as if something behind the bark had taken a breath and decided against another. I followed the line back because there was nothing else to do, because the woods, full as they are of stories, still come down to left foot, right foot. The bundles along the way were still swinging, slower now, answering some motion I couldn't name. I kept glancing left and right for a second line and saw none. Twice I thought I heard someone walking just off to my side, a step that kept my pace and stopped when I stopped. But it might have been my own breath, confused by the low fog. When the line took me back to the first maple I'd seen it on, I reached out and plucked it once more, a little harder. It gave a deep, soft note I felt in my teeth. Then I cut it with the knife because the part of me that comes from people who build fences demanded something be finished. When the thread parted, it didn't fray, it sliced clean. The cut end drew back a fraction like a living thing testing a retreat. I half expected the line to slack and fall. It didn't. It held itself up between the trees without any help I could see, humming faint and steady, stretched to a new, tight truth. I left it there and walked out of Fern Valley with the fog rubbing at my knees, telling myself the story I'd tell if someone asked. Kids, art, a prank that almost got me tripped. No one asked. No one ever does when a thing smells like you might tell it wrong. For a few days I dreamed of the oak and woke with the sweet sour in my mouth like a fruit gone to drink. On the fourth morning, there was a thread tied around my mailbox post, black and tight, knotted into a small loop at the back where the paint is blistered. It hummed when the trucks went by, even though the air was still. I cut it and dropped it in the trash. It was back by noon, loop and all, and a little clay face hung from it, cracked at the edges, mouth carved in a straight line like someone who knows a secret and is practicing how to keep it. I told myself I'd move the box to the far side of the yard when the ground thawed. That night, before sleep, I thought I heard the bundles in the valley swing themselves into agreement with something far away. In the morning, the knife I'd used was clean and dry, and somehow sticky, like sap, and the thread at the mailbox hummed a note I felt in my teeth even after I stepped away from it. Story 6. The Bone Piles of Whispering Gap. They call it Whispering Gap because even on a still day, the wind threads that low pass like a needle through cloth, carrying somebody else's breath along with yours. Every kid in our hollow grows up hearing not to walk it after dark, same as you don't swim the quarry at night or burn green wood on a stove. I told myself I was going up there for exercise and to shake the week off me. The truth is, I wanted to look straight at the thing folks only point at with their chins. It was late afternoon when I started up, sky the color of dishwater, the ridges on either side shouldering the sun down faster than it needed to go. Oaks gave way to laurel, and then to the scrub that survives where wind rubs the ground raw. By the time I reached the mouth of the gap, that long, narrow throat between the hills, the air had that winter-bitten bite to it, even though it was October. The bones began small and cautious, like punctuation you might miss in a long sentence. 3 vertebrae stacked at the base of a rock, a little pyramid of field mouse skulls no bigger than my thumbnail. I stopped, more from respect than fear at first, and leaned over the closest pile. The bones were clean in a way rain alone doesn't make. The smoothness of time, but the intention of a hand. Farther in, the piles thickened and complicated, quail wings dried to pale fans that still knew the arc of a body. Tiny ribs laddered into crosses, jawbones laid side by side to make an oval like the outline of a small face. Nothing big, not deer, not dog. Things a fox could catch, things a trap would take without a thump. Whispering Gap itself felt like standing inside a giant's breath. The wind didn't whoop or shove. It threaded through, steady enough to set the grass shivering in one direction while my jacket lay flat in another. In that slipstream was a sound that wasn't quite a sound, the way a church full of people feels when the hymn book is up and no one's voice has landed yet. You could tell yourself it's just turbulence tangled in laurel. You could tell yourself anything if you're trying to keep walking. I did, and I set my boots carefully so I didn't kick any of the stacks apart because, whatever else I am, I was raised not to scatter what somebody arranged with purpose. The flat rock sat about dead center in the pass, shoulder high on me, the kind of slab boys would stand on to dare each other at noon. Bones were laid on it, in a shape my head recognized before my mouth did. A person, crude and exact at the same time, signed in white. Arm bones for arms, matched femurs for legs, shorter than they should have been, a row of teeth for a smile that looked cut into a jack-o'-lantern too early in the season. The skull at the top wasn't a skull at all, but a circle of little joints, vertebrae nested in a loop, and 2 bent nails are for eyes. I thought of shrines and roadside crosses and the way people mark where something took and something gave. The wind ran a seam along my neck and slipped under my collar as if it knew the exact way my shirt was buttoned. I bent down out of habit, all field man and not enough sense, to see if the nails had been driven or only placed. Up close I could smell the bones, not rot, never that, but chalk and dust, so dry it seized the back of my throat. One nail had no rust on the tip, just a bright mouth where it had been bitten off by a pair of pliers recently. I had that thought, clear as a glass of water, and when I lifted my head, I realized the wind had changed direction without turning the grass. The piles around me had changed with it. Where there had been 3 vertebrae, now there were 4. Where a neat oval of jawbones had sat, it had grown into an open circle as if waiting for something to enter. 5 steps behind me, a new stack, tiny phalanges arranged like a spray of leaflets, sat in the scuff of my last footprint. It wasn't just the change, it was the way of it, the quiet, the efficiency, the patience that said this could go on whether I watched or not. The sound braided in the wind tightened into a word I almost knew. A single beat repeated with the soft persistence of someone rehearsing a name they don't want to forget. The mouth in my chest wanted to speak back, to give it my name or ask for its. But every instinct I'd earned by staying alive told me not to lend a sound to it. I backed off the rock, Bones Man still smiling because I couldn't change the way it had been set, and I tried to see the edges of the gap rather than what it held. A child's sneaker sat under a spray of maidenhair fern on the shaded side, toe pointing upslope. No laces, no mate. It wasn't fresh. It had the faded look of something that had seen rain and sun and patience. I don't know why that sneaker tilted the world for me more than the bones had. Maybe because bones in a place like this can be any animal, but a shoe belongs to a foot that once ran downhill fast enough to fall and laughed about it. I told myself to leave in a voice that sounded like my father's when he didn't raise it because he didn't have to. The wind obliged by pushing the thought along, carrying it back to me from in front like a friend leading another out of a bar by the elbow. The piles did not tumble, they grew. As I eased toward the mouth of the gap, little stacks rose as I passed them. As if my shadow laid mortar. A circle I hadn't seen at knee height on a stump became a tower that watched the top of my thigh. I quit looking at the details and kept my eyes where the light widened between the ridges. The word in the wind shortened, the way a song does when someone hums only the part they cannot let go of. Twice I thought I felt a small tap at the back of my calf, and twice I refused to look, because looking is consent in places where nobody asked you to come. Out in the open, the sound slackened, and the wind went back to being what it had always been, air with a purpose. I walked the 2 miles home with my shoulders set, trying not to be theatrical about how I didn't look over them. By the time I saw my mailbox, I had told myself a dozen good reasons for everything I'd seen. Kids, foxes, a person with too much time in their hands and not enough in their heart. The porch looked the way it always did at that hour. Rail warm from the last of the sun, paint flaking in patient curls, the dog asleep beside the door as if sleep were a job. I set my hand on the top rail the way I always do coming up the steps and felt it. Not wood, not sun. A texture like a handful of dry pasta. I looked down and there it lay, neat as a gift. It was not as large as the figure on the rock, not even as big as my hand. Tiny ulnae for arms, matched bird bones for legs splayed out straight, a loop of vertebrae for a head, no nails for eyes this time, 2 dark seeds pressed into dabbed clay, the kind you find under the sunflower heads when the birds are done. It had been laid on the rail with care so it wouldn't roll, and in that care was the part that lit the fuse in my chest. This wasn't a threat, it was something worse. It was a continuation, a way of saying the gap wasn't a place between ridges, but a path that can be folded and unfolded wherever it needs to be. I did not sweep it off. I am not a man who can toss a thing arranged so carefully and live with the sound it would make. I slipped my mail under it, walked around it to the door, and felt, ridiculous as it sounds, rude for not acknowledging it. Inside, I filled a bowl with water I didn't drink and stood at the sink until I had words I trusted. I told myself I would take it at dark and carry it to the edge of the yard and set it under the sassafras where the ground goes soft in spring, and in the morning I would call the one person in town who still knows how to bless a threshold without laughter. I told myself a lot of things. Night came on thick and late, and with it the wind turned toward the pass in a way I could feel without opening the window. I lay there working at sleep like a splinter and thinking about that word braided into air. Around midnight the house let out the sighs old wood keeps, and the dog lifted his head and set it back down without a sound. In the morning the porch rail was empty. The paint had a clean line where something had rested, like cracking ice leaves after a glass is lifted. On the step sat a single vertebra, small as a button, bright as a tooth. It had rolled or been set 1/2 inch from the door, as if to measure how close is close enough. I left for work through the back and spent the day trying not to hear the wind saying a syllable I didn't recognize, trying not to say it back in my head, and failing in the quiet moments where that small white circle turned and stopped just short of the word it wanted. Story 7. The route circle at Raven's Bend. Raven's Bend is a crooked place even on a map, a long, slow elbow of the creek where the hills lean in and hush each other. I was deep in there late October, pockets full of hickory nuts and hands smelling like pennyroyal, working the low slope where the sun barely gets a say. The air had the thin cold that makes your teeth feel taller, and the leaves underfoot had gone from bragging to brittle. I wasn't thinking about anything beyond the next patch of chanterelles when I saw the ground ahead rise up wrong. Roots the thickness of my arm had surfaced and grown together into a ring. Not random, deliberate. They rose 1.5 feet, braided and knuckled, as if a buried hand had closed into a fist and fossilized. Inside that circle, everything was bare. No leaves, no twigs, no acorns or squirrel trash. Just smooth dirt, tamped like a floor. The wind should have been sliding through those trees the way it always does, snagging on dead grapevine and nagging at your ears. But inside the ring, the air held a weight and a warmth that didn't belong to October. I remember stepping over, half because I didn't want to scuff the rim, half because I didn't want to test it, and feeling my body register a change the way a mule knows a snake in grass. Some old part of me stood up while the rest pretended not to see. In the exact center of that circle sat a mask, carved from a slab of wood, not polished, not pretty. The eyes were holes, oval, clean, too smooth to be done with a pocket knife. A thin slit for a mouth, no paint, no strap. It faced up like it had been set to watch the sky give its answers. I should have left it alone. There are a dozen simple rules you get taught without anyone saying them, and don't pick up what you didn't set down, ought to be the first. But the air inside that ring made my hands forget rules. It was warm the way the inside of a barn gets after the animals have gone and left their heat in the boards. A softness that made the back of my neck cool in contrast. I crouched without thinking, one knee leaving no mark in the dust because the dust didn't stick. My fingertips touched the wood, expecting the coarse feel of an old fence plank. It was slicker than it should have been, as if handled and handled until the oil in skin had taught it a quiet shine. The hollows of the eyes were deep, too deep for the thickness I could see, and I thought for a second I'd feel a draft out of those holes, like a mouth breathing. That was when I heard the movement behind me. Not a deer-breaking brush, not a single body making a decision. It was small and many, a scurrying like mice if mice weighed enough to shift old leaves and know to keep a beat. I froze the way animals do when they reveal themselves by pretending not to be there. The sound grew, layered into itself until it was like 1,000 erasers sweeping a classroom floor, and then it stopped all at once, like a hand had flattened out in the air. I lifted my head. The woods beyond the ring had gone darker than they had any right to. It wasn't a storm dark or a cloud passing. It was as if someone had turned the page too early on the day, and the print of trees was there without the light that lets you read it. I stood slow, the way you do when you're trying not to tell a thing you've seen it. My boot nose met the inside of the root circle and balked. I cannot explain this in a way that makes me sound like I deserve a driver's license. Stepping back over those roots felt wrong in my ankles, like the ground beyond was slightly lower than it had been, like the first step would be longer than the leg I was wearing. Something in me suggested staying until the balance was right again, and something else, older, suggested leaving before the balance found me. I kept my eyes off the mask because I'd read my name if I looked too long into those holes. I told my feet to move, and they did, but not over the ring. Along it, hand out to feel the warm air hold close to my palm as I slid around to the place where I'd first stepped in. Crossing out felt like putting your hand into cold dishwater you'd forgotten you left. The air grabbed my skin with chill and damp in a way it hadn't on the way in, and for a heartbeat, the dark under the laurels thickened like a clot. Then the woods snapped back to their previous October, and I could see detail again. The tooth edge of oak leaves, the green veins still stubborn in a beech. I turned and looked at the ring from the outside. Inside it, the dirt held my knee print now, faint, like it had decided after a meeting. The mask sat where it had, unchanged except for the sense that its eyes had noticed the sky and were unimpressed. My first thought was to bury it. My second, not far behind, was to tell somebody who could say a right word over a wrong thing. Instead, I marked 3 trees with a hatchet swipe at shoulder height, a triangle to point the way back, and left. All the way down to the creek, I kept hearing that soft many sound at my back, never gaining, never losing, not quite in step with me, like the valley itself had found a new way to breathe and was practicing. At the bend where folks throw their empty bait tubs, I drank straight from the cold because I needed the shock of it to anchor me to something I knew won't lie. That night, the house held quiet, like a plate holds a stain, visible but still part of what it is. I woke twice from the kind of dream that leaves you arguing with furniture. Both times I couldn't remember details, only the certainty of waiting in a space shaped like a circle, eyes up, breath measured so it wouldn't disturb dust. At 3 a.m, a breeze ran the eaves like fingers testing teeth on a comb, and I heard leaves tap each other in a pattern that was not wind's work. I don't claim I'm brave, but I am stubborn. I sat up, put my feet on the floor, and watched the black window until grey came, counting heartbeats to convince myself the counting belonged to me. I went back 2 days later because you can't let your map redraw itself without checking what the new lines really say. The hatchet marks were there, still wet white. The ring was there, unchanged, the warmth inside a little fainter as the day had turned colder. But the dirt wasn't smooth anymore. Someone, or something, if you need that word, had traced a track around the mask in a shallow circle, a path that showed lighter where feet had compressed and lifted over and over, careful steps the size of a small person's. No prints, not the kind you could photograph and prove a tale with, just a worn track. I tried to tell myself, raccoons. I tried hard. The mask had moved a hair, or the path had made it look moved, the same way a creek seems to shift boulders just by practicing around them for years. I didn't touch it that time. I stood at the ring and let the warmth fog my glasses and thought about all the small things in a life that come dressed as choices but are really doors. I said aloud, "I'm not taking you." I didn't know who I meant, but it felt necessary. The soft many sound arrived then, not behind me this time but under the ground, as if what scurried was learning the map of my soul's. The light tilted, and I realized it was because I'd leaned without meaning to, like gravity was having a private conversation with my balance. I left faster than I came. Tried not to let it look like running, failed. 2 weeks later, I woke, standing beside my bed, one hand cupped like I was carrying a delicate thing I didn't want to spill. There was nothing in it. The pose embarrassed me in a way no one else could have fixed. I went to the sink and washed until the lines in my palms stood up angry and pink. After work, there on my porch lay a thin rope of brittle roots arranged in a circle, small, exact, the size of a dinner plate. In the center sat a slice of oak, sanded smooth, empty where eyes would go. I picked it up even though every part of me had voted against it. It was warm, not from sun. It had rained, warm like the memory of a hand. I keep seeing that mask in my sleep, not moving, not threatening, sitting in the exact center of that cleared circle, as patient as a winter, as certain as the way a creek teaches stone. In the dream, I kneel, and the warmth closes around me like a borrowed coat. The soft many starts up, and when I look past the ring, the woods are too dark for the time of day, the way a mouth can be too quiet even while it smiles. I always wake before I touch it. Every morning I go out and check the porch, and every morning there's a dustless ring where that root circle lay the first time, like a mark a cup leaves, as if something is reminding me that stepping out is harder than stepping in. And that patience, more than hunger, is what keeps a thing waiting. Story 8. The Candle Jars of Wolfpine Bluff. Wolfpine Bluff isn't on any marked trail worth mentioning. It's a narrow spine of rock that overlooks a stretch of forest so dense and uneven, most folks wouldn't bother crossing it even in daylight. I'd gone out late that day, later than I should have, telling myself I'd make the bluff before sunset and get back with just enough light to find my way without a flashlight. The air had that kind of stillness that makes every sound, your boot scuff, a snapped twig, carry farther than you want. I came up the last rise and saw them before I was close enough to make sense of them. 13 glass jars, clear but clouded with age, lined evenly along the bluff's edge like sentries. Each one held a single black candle burned down to the halfway point. The wax was hardened in strange ripples, as though it had cooled in a breeze that wasn't there. The wicks were bent and dark, yet faint curls of smoke lifted from them, too thin to be heat and too steady to be wind. Inside each jar, tucked beside the candle, was something small, bits of hair coiled like old sewing thread, paper scraps gone soft at the edges, a button tarnished dull silver, a cracked bead. They were arranged with the kind of care that means something to someone, even if that someone isn't you. I leaned over one jar to see the writing on the paper, but the words had bled into a smear, the ink wandering off into the candle wax. That's when I heard it. A low hum, not from the woods, not from my own chest, but from the jars themselves, as if each one was catching and holding the same note. The sound made me forget the cold until I felt a shift in the air behind me. A shadow slipped across the ground, quick, clean, gone, before my eyes caught up. My head snapped around. The trail was empty, but the space between the trees seemed thicker, as though something had leaned in to watch and then stepped back. I swallowed, and when I turned to face the bluff again, the candles were lit, every single one. The flames were steady, not guttering in the breeze off the ridge, and they all flickered in unison, bending the same way, like they were answering to the same breath. I don't remember making the choice to leave, my body just did it. My boots found the trail, my eyes kept forward, and my ears told me the hum had grown quieter but never stopped. I didn't look back until I was halfway down the slope, and by then the bluff was lost in the trees, as though it had folded itself away. That night, I sat on the porch longer than I meant to, watching the yard without meaning to watch it. The wind in the pines sounded almost like the hum if I let my mind wander. I told myself it was nothing, that my nerves had run ahead of my sense. I went inside, locked the door, and tried not to think about the jars. The next evening, just after sundown, I stepped out to bring in the day's mail. At the bottom of the porch steps sat a single glass jar. The candle inside was black, burned halfway down. A faint thread of smoke rose from its wick, curling into the cooling air. Inside, next to the candle, was a scrap of paper folded twice. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The glass was warm when I picked it up, and the hum I thought I'd imagined last night was there again, soft and steady, like a voice holding the first word of something it wasn't ready to say. Story 9. The Circle of Ash in Elkthorne Hollow. Elkthorne Hollow isn't a place you find by accident. The trail in is barely a trail at all, just a washed-out scar through the laurel that climbs until your legs burn, then drops without warning into a low bowl between ridges. I went in on a dare from a friend who'd only heard stories, expecting to find nothing but rusted tin and the bones of old logging shacks. The air down there felt heavier, like the hollow was holding on to a different season than the one I'd left on the ridge. I broke into the clearing and stopped. In the center was a perfect circle, maybe 30 feet across, nothing but grey ash inside it. Not a single weed, not a scatter of twigs. Outside the line, the forest stood unbothered. Green moss, leaf litter, the ordinary clutter of woods. Inside, it was bare and pale, as if a fire had burned there just yesterday, but not a single tree on the edge showed scorch marks. At the center of that ash circle rose a post, taller than me, carved with symbols that didn't look like letters but had been etched deep enough to catch shadow. The base was stained dark, the color of old blood in wood grain, and the stain ran only a few inches up before the pale, untouched surface took over. I circled it slowly, keeping outside the ash, telling myself I'd step in just once I'd had a look. The farther I walked, the quieter it got. I didn't notice it at first, the way you don't notice a clock stopping until your mind reaches for its tick and finds nothing. But somewhere around my third step, I realized the wind had gone still. The chatter of birds dropped out. My own footfalls dulled, as though the sound was being pulled down into the ash. By the time I was halfway around, I couldn't even hear my breathing. It was like the air itself had shut its ears. Then I saw them, footprints in the ash, crisp and sharp-edged, leading straight from the post toward me, bare feet. The ash wasn't disturbed anywhere else. No shuffle, no drag, just a direct line, heel to toe. Until the last print stopped inches from where I stood. The sight hit me harder than it should have. I glanced up, half expecting someone to be standing there close enough to touch. But the circle was empty, the silence thickened. My body knew to back away before my mind caught up. I took a step, slow and deliberate, until my boots were planted firmly on moss again. The air rushed back in, not as wind but as sound, all at once. Leaves shifting, branches creaking, my own breath loud and ragged. I didn't finish the circle. I didn't look back at the post. By the time I made it to the trailhead, the light had started to fade, and my ears felt strange, like they'd been stuffed with cotton and just now cleared. That night, every time I closed my eyes, I saw the line of footprints again, stopping just short of me, like whoever made them had stood there, waiting. 3 days later, I stepped out onto my porch and found a faint dusting of grey across the boards, not from pollen or dirt. Ash. Right in the centre was a single bare footprint, toes pointing toward my front door.